Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about story structures, more specifically the 3-act structure. Now in this video I'm going to be using 3 different pieces of media for examples throughout, so obviously this is going to be full of spoilers for those 3 pieces of media. Lucky for you, they've been out for quite a while, so you're probably safe. Now I'm going to be talking about this topic very broadly, so if you want to skip ahead to the juicy bits of the acts themselves, time cards are in the description. Now first question is, what are story structures good for? I think the first and most important thing that you understand about story structures is that they aren't meant to be formulas. They're schematics that can help fiction enthusiasts and writers alike break down narrative to better understand its inner workings. And yes, they can be used as rough roadmaps to help writers stitch the flurry of loose ideas and inspiration into something cohesive, but if you're gonna use them that way, just remember to not treat them like an instruction manual. As Sid Field put in his book titled Screenplay, obviously titled before keywords and searchability was a thing, story determines structure. Structure does not determine story. Story structures aren't formulas, rather they're a form. Or, as Sid Field put it, they're paradigms. A paradigm is a model, example, or conceptual scheme. The paradigm of a table, for example, is a top with 4 legs. He then goes on to list all sorts of different types of tables. You have round, you have square, you have tall, you have short, you have metal, you have wood. And I think this comparison works really well because it isn't that it's impossible to make a 3-legged table, or a 3-inch high table, or a table made entirely out of chocolate. And sometimes people like a weird as table, especially if it serves as an art piece. But no one will cry lack of creativity if you make a table that is a flat slab with 4 legs. And tables don't take that standard form because they're following a formula, but rather because it's the form best suited for a table. And that is what story structures are. And yes, to get ahead of the handful of you who are already typing out comments, essentially any story can be shoved into the box that is any decent story structure. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, rather that's just because these story structures are all different observations of centuries of successful stories. They're all observations of the same thing. And the structures are just different ways of formatting and presenting that information. Dan Harmon, for example, looked at the hero's journey and said, I want that, but simpler. Now, does that mean that you could pick any story structure so there's no reason to learn more than one? Sure, just like you could pick any flavor of ice cream and happily eat that for the rest of forever, because I mean, really, are there any bad flavors of ice cream? Pause for a second, comment down below what's an ice cream flavor that you absolutely hate, for science. But at the end of the day, trying different flavors means you might find something that you like better, and that'll make your life just a little bit sweeter. And who doesn't want that in these trying times? And for all of you who already left a comment saying that every story can fit every narrative structure, you may kindly edit your comment and include an ice cream flavor that you hate, because those are the rules. Alright, now let's briefly talk history, because it's interesting as f and I make the rules. Now, the person most often credited with compiling the 3-act structure is Sid Field in his 1978 book Screenplay. But in truth, the structure was technically first presented by Aristotle. Yes, I'm talking about Greek philosopher Aristotle. So given how popular the 3-act structure is for screenplay writing, it's no surprise that most people tend to attribute it to Sid Field, rather than the philosopher from a time where the word screen didn't even exist. But Aristotle is the author of the first playwriting manual on record, Poetics, which I don't own, I don't know why I'm still holding up this book, which documented his observations of elements that he saw over and over again in Greek theater. Not because these people had access to guides, but because they themselves watched other plays and saw what worked for them as viewers. Though it's worth noting that all Aristotle did was note down the existence of a beginning, a middle, and an end. So to credit Sid Field, he did refine the structure, and 500 million people have then taken that model and added details of their own that don't have enough difference to merit their own name. Now, the fundamentals. Let's talk duration. Now, in case you weren't paying attention, there are 3 acts in the 3-act structure. Act 1 is meant to take up 1/4 of the story, Act 2 is meant to take up 2/4 of the story, and then Act 3 is meant to take up the last 1/4 of the story. Yes, I could have condensed that middle fraction, and I didn't, and I'm not gonna fix that. So you might be thinking, are we doing weird time splits here to adhere to an observation made by a guy who's been dead for 2 millennia?
It's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge? Plato.
But more likely the reason that we kept the 3-act structure and not a 4-act structure that would divide that more evenly is that humans really just hate even numbers. 7-point plot structure, the 17 stages of monomyth. 15B plot sheet, the 5-act structure. Coincidence? I think not. Dan Harmon went off script, but we let him get away with it because his structure looks like a pizza. But I vastly digress. Now, last thing before we get into the acts, let's talk POV. The hero's journey focuses on the stages that the hero goes through, but true to its origin, the 3-act structure is instead from the point of view of the audience, which means that the 3-act structure can be applied to non-linear narratives. As an example, Memento. Memento is a story told backwards. The main character suffers from retrograde amnesia and spends the movie trying to hunt down and kill the person who murdered his wife. The film opens at the end, but because the audience is seeing the story for the first time, the climactic event feels like an inciting incident. Likewise, what would have been the inciting incident chronologically happens at the end of the film, and since it causes a complete shift in the audience's perception of the character, it serves as a climax. So now on to the core of the topic, the acts themselves. So first off, we have Act 1, which is setup. This is where stories hook the audience, provide context, introduce the setting, theme, and lay the foundation upon which the story will be built. This is where you answer the question of who, when, and where, and give the audience a set of questions which will hold their interest over until the action of Act 2. Now, Act 1 usually takes up the first 1/4 of the story, but there are of course exceptions. For example, Hunger Games and Inception have extremely long first acts. Within this act, you'll find a couple components. Firstly, we have the hook. This section is called the hook because it grabs the audience and holds their attention until the inciting incident can pull them in. In Ender's Game, we start out with the line,
"I've watched through his eyes, I've listened through his ears, and I tell you, he's the one."
Or at least as close as we're going to get, giving the reader a whole bunch of questions. And that intro then transitions straight into Ender having his monitor removed. In WALL-E, this is the first 13 minutes or so, up until the spaceship lands and Eve is deposited. This establishes WALL-E's character, his want, and hooks the viewer into his world. In Guardians of the Galaxy, this is a hefty 15 to 17 minutes and focuses on introducing Peter as a character as well as Ronan as the main opposing force. It establishes tone and setting as well as character want and need. Which brings us to the next beat of importance, which is the inciting incident. This takes place halfway through the first act and is what disturbs the status quo. It takes the character's ordinary world and introduces a problem, a question that needs answering. And then the rest of the time from this point to the next beat is generally taken up by the character either refusing the call or preparing to do something about it. In Ender's Game, the event that most sets things into motion is when Ender faces the bully, at a fast-paced page 5 of the book. The next morning, Colonel Graff interrupts Ender's breakfast. He asks Ender why he attacked the bully so viciously, to which Ender gives a highly relevant response.
"Knocking him down was the first fight. I wanted to win all the next ones too."
Colonel Graff then invites him to battle school. In WALL-E, this is Eve's arrival on the planet. The finding of the plant is noteworthy, but it doesn't set anything into motion, and honestly, the timing is a little suspect. And then, rather than a period of WALL-E refusing the call, we get the flip side where Eve ignores him, he rescues her from a sandstorm and shows her the plant, she shuts down, and then the avoiding the call continues in a manner of WALL-E trying to wake Eve. In Guardians of the Galaxy, this is the moment where Gamora, Rocket Raccoon, and Groot jump Peter at the same time, which leads to them being captured and imprisoned, thus setting everything in motion. And then at the very end of Act 1, we have plot point 1. This is generally described as the moment when the protagonist makes a decision that they can't come back from. This beat is often called lock-in because it's the moment when the protagonist is locked into the plot. Plot points are the most powerful when they involve a conscious decision on the part of the character and also push the plot into new territory. In Ender's Game, this hits almost exactly at the 1/4 mark of the book and is the point where Ender wins against Bernard and graduates from his launch group to Salamander Army. And true to the first plot point, this is a game changer, pun intended, that throws Ender headfirst into a brand new setting and situation. In WALL-E, this is the spaceship coming back and taking Eve, and WALL-E making the conscious decision to grab onto the spaceship, which takes him off into space and straight into Act 2. And in Guardians, this is the moment where Peter steps in and saves Gamora from Drax. This is a protagonist-driven moment and sets the plot in a different direction where the group is now a team. And that brings us right into Act 2, which is confrontation, otherwise known as rising action, conflict, antithesis. I honestly do not know which one is right. So Act 2 is where the story gets thick, and it's generally where B-plot comes in. And within Act 2, our first beat is Pinch Point 1. Now, pinch points are often neglected, but I'm going to talk about them because I think they're important. The second act is a long one, and stories can very easily sag here. So the pinch points are pillars that hold up that middle so it doesn't sag. To help you remember the placement, if like me, your brain always wants to go plot point, the pinch points pinch the middle point. This bit is often preceded by a training montage, the upbeat fun and games where most of the trailer clips will come from. Now, pinch points, true to their name, are an application of pressure. Generally, they take the form of a reminder that the antagonist has the power to prevent the protagonist from achieving their goal, and the fun and games can't go on forever. They can also be mini turning points, or the introduction of new information, which in the case of this first pinch point, serves to foreshadow and set up the midpoint. In Ender's Game, the real role of antagonistic force in the story is generally the adults, as well as others in positions of power such as Bonzo. So our pinch point here is that Ender wins the battle for Salamander Army by disobeying Bonzo. And then on page 68, Bonzo hits Ender and informs him that he's been traded to Rat Army. Now, WALL-E doesn't follow standard timelines, so this pinch point actually happens smack dab in the middle and is thus often interpreted as a midpoint. So the way I see it, this is when Eve is brought to the captain, but they find the plant is missing. It's a twist moment, and is when we first see the co-pilot, who is the true antagonistic force. This ends with a show of force from the co-pilot, with Eve being deactivated and her and WALL-E being sent to the repair wing. In Guardians, this is the moment where Groot starts the plan off early, thus throwing everything into chaos and causing a twist in the plot. But we're also, as an audience, handed the other side of this pinch point, when we get to watch Ronan invade the prison in a show of force. Now again, the 3-act structure is from the point of view of the audience, so even though this is something the Guardians don't witness, we witness it, and therefore it contributes to this pinch point. Which brings us to the midpoint, and this happens, as you probably assumed, right in the center of most stories. And at this point, something huge shifts and steers the plot in a different direction. Generally, what we see is that this shift matches the tone of the climax, but is then the opposite of the culmination of Act 2. So if this is a common happy or bittersweet ending, then you'll see a small success here, a large failure at the culmination of Act 2, and then a success in the climax. But if the story ends badly, this would be a negative shift with a big success in the next beat. Basically, the audience is looking for an up and down roller coaster ride. In Ender's Game, this happens in chapter 10, right on page 111, which in my 226 page version is almost right in the middle. And this is where Ender is promptly promoted to be commander of Dragon Army. This already solid shift is then further spiced up by the fact that the group is comprised of the worst students, which is, of course, a challenge meant to test Ender. This is a positive shift. In WALL-E, this is where even WALL-E escape from the repair wing. They face the security bots and are labeled as a security threat. They fight their way out, and Eve tries to send WALL-E away in the escape pod. WALL-E then ends up shot out with the plant, he breaks out of the pod, and Eve goes and gets him. It's a high point, a success, because at the end of it, they're both free and they have the plant. In Guardians, this is smack dab in the middle at the 59-ish minute mark. And this finds our Guardians at the collector shop, where it's revealed that the orb is an infinity stone. And in a firework display, we get to see a little sample of the destructive power of the stone. This not only takes our heroes' victory right out from their grasp, but dumps a bunch of morality onto their heads and forces them to think about more than just themselves as they consider whether or not they should turn the stone over to Nova Corps. Which brings us to the second pinch point, which you already knew was coming. And this is where things ramp up and get serious. Stakes are raised. And all of this serves to build towards the second plot point, which is coming up, so these should be closely linked in cause and effect. Much like the first pinch point, this applies new pressure to them, which sends them straight into the pits of despair. In Ender's Game, this is chapter 12, in which Ender and Bonzo face off and it results in Bonzo's death, which deals a hard psychological blow to Ender. He failed to take down Bonzo without becoming as bad as Peter. In WALL-E, this is where they take the plant back to the captain, and the co-pilot reveals his true colors and electrocutes WALL-E, sending him, Eve, and the plant down the trash chute. And in Guardians of the Galaxy, Drax reveals their location to Ronan so he can kill him. This results in a fleet attacking, Gamora nearly dying, Peter self-sacrificing, and Ronan getting his hands on the stone. And at the very end of Act 2, we have Plot Point 2. And this is where we get the heart-to-heart, where characters stop and take a moment to address the mental toll of the last pinch point. It's quiet, slow, and a dialogue-heavy beat. And this is where the character gets a new spark, inspiration to set out and take on the antagonistic force no matter the odds. The key element here, much like Plot Point 1, is that it's a conscious decision on the part of the character. In Ender's Game, this happens in chapter 13, which is titled Valentine, and it's the heart-to-heart they share. He knows that to return to space and fight, he'll have to take the role of Peter once more, and that will hurt him. But he needs to save Valentine, and so he decides that he has to do it. In WALL-E, this is where Eve rescues WALL-E in the trash chute, and they have a sort of heart-to-heart. Where she just wants to help fix him, but he wants her to focus on the plant to get the humans back to Earth. In the end, even WALL-E do kind of trade off lead role a lot in these beats, so in this case, WALL-E ends up convincing Eve to go back and keep fighting. And in Guardians of the Galaxy, this is where the Guardians are on the ship with Yondu, and they have a little bit of a heart-to-heart, and Peter reveals his 12% of a plan, and they all agree to take on Ronan for the good of the galaxy.
Now I'm standing. You all happy? We're all standing up now. Bunch of jackasses standing in a circle.
Which brings us straight into Act 3, which is Resolution. And the first beat of this you probably saw coming, and that is Climax. You all know what this plot beat is. It's the culmination. It's everything that the plot's been leading to. It's a huge action sequence, and often the character's only able to win and overcome it through allies or lessons that they gain throughout the story. In Ender's Game, this starts at command school and is the rising tension of Dragon Army training in the simulations, rising to a climax where Ender is pushed over the edge and breaks the rules in the game, but as a result destroys the buggers. The final blow in the climax is the reveal that it wasn't a simulation. The buggers are actually dead. And Ender's pushing the rules, though ultimately victorious, cost even more lives, and that blood is on his hands. In WALL-E, this is the captain activating the plan, and even WALL-E fighting along with the broken robots to get the plant to the receptacle. It ends with them winning, but with WALL-E gravely injured. In Guardians of the Galaxy, Ronan's ship crashes and there's a huge showdown, one in which Peter distracts Ronan with a dance-off that I swear only this movie and Chris Pratt could pull off.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Bring it down hard.
And then in a show of the theme and character arcs, they're able to contain the power of the stone by joining hands and weathering the power together. And that brings us to our final beat, which is wrap up. And this is where we establish the new status quo and tie up loose ends. Sometimes this takes the form of an epilogue, and sometimes it's just winding things down. And stories don't need to tie up all loose ends in this stage. If they're a series, you're gonna wanna leave some of them open, but the main story is acknowledged and resolved in this phase. In Ender's Game, this takes the form of the last chapter, which is titled Speaker for the Dead, which is essentially an epilogue and is where Ender learns of the Pupa Queen, which sets up questions for later books to explore. In WALL-E, this takes the form of the ship returning to Earth and Eve repairing WALL-E, and in Guardians of the Galaxy, this is when the Guardians are issued a pardon and their slates are wiped clean, and they all head off together, staying as a team, which rings true to the theme of the movie overall. The wrap-up is a short beat and is really just tying up those last little loose ends and just making sure that the climax doesn't drop people off in the middle, just giving you a sense that the story continues after you're gone. And that's the last beat. That is the 3-act structure. Now, if you're anything like me, then you like to use these narrative structures as a rough roadmap for outlining. And you're gonna need somewhere to note that down. And please, for the love of Skycat, do not note it down on note cards, especially if you own a cat, especially if you own a cat that likes to chew on paper. Rest in peace, ALETHEIA draft number 3. But lucky lucky for you, today's sponsor has a 37% cat-proof outlining feature. Campfire Pro is a downloadable writing software that has all sorts of cool writerly features, from character and world building information tracking to corkboard style maps, and most importantly in this case, timelines. It's like note cards, but semi-cat proof, and you can't lose them, and if your handwriting looks anything like mine, it has the added perk that you can actually read your outline. It turns out that's important. The software is a one-time purchase of $49.99, and there is also a free 10-day trial. There is a link in the description, and I also have a demo video covering the different features of the software, so I'll put that in the end cards. If you like narrative structures and want to try more flavors, I have a whole playlist. I will put that in the end cards and in the description. And that was it for this video. To the 88% of you who aren't subscribed, what the hell are you doing? The button is right there. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.